Okay, so I'd actually intended to make this video yesterday, but the uploading time for the last two was just taking a long time. Okay, I want to speak about this event, Tiananmen Square. Um, there's been a lot of coverage of the 30th anniversary, and that's good. There should be. Every time it's discussed, every time it is covered, that is just another reminder of the fact that whilst China's Communist Party its ruling regime can hide the truth from 1.4 billion people or try to. They can't hide this from the rest of the world. They just can't do it. With as much as they might try, they can't do it. Um, the thing about Tiananmen Square is actually in the list of communist crimes, as terrible as it was, it's um, it's not on the sort of scale of the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward, which killed tens of millions of people, particularly the Great Leap Forward. But the significant thing about Tiananmen Square was the fact that it was filmed. The whole process of what developed with that was filmed. International news networks were there. Kate Adie, who's from my city, Sunderland, experienced BBC reporter, was there. The world was watching, and Beijing's response to this was brute force. So it's important to understand some of the basics of what happened. Firstly, there's a few misconceptions. We always think of the students of Tiananmen Square. Whilst it's true students played a very central role in the protests, they were not the only people dissatisfied with the Communist Party at that time. In fact, millions of ordinary Chinese laborers, many others, were also on some level involved in protests, maybe not as hard sort of as in that ideological passion as the students. But the truth is, there were a lot of different reasons for discontent. Certainly, the students were pushing for democracy, but there was actually other grievances going on in China at that time, much like there were other grievances going on in the lead up to the Arab Spring movement. Um, so there were hunger strikes. There were a lot of things going on. I've just watched an interesting report from ABC News at the time, and it showed that there were actually many examples of student leaders getting into dialogue with soldiers, begging them not to, the People's Liberation Army, not to fire on the people. And what's notable, if you look at the footage, is many of these PLA soldiers were young soldiers. Many of them were visibly uncomfortable with the position that they were in. They didn't want to look directly at the students. Um, the truth is, this decision was taken at the top. It was taken by the regime of Deng Xiaoping, excuse me, um, and Li Peng, the prime minister at the time. What's notable is the party itself was divided on how to deal with that. Two reformist leaders, Hu Yaopang, who had died, that was a major turning point, and Zhao Ziyang, who was kind of temporarily purged for being too conciliatory towards students. In fact, he was openly sympathetic to their demands, and he was actually kicked out of the party, or at least kicked out of the Central Committee, the Politburo, temporarily, because he had been seen as too conciliatory. He had begged the students to leave the square and the surrounding area. That's another thing about Tiananmen Square. We talk about the square itself. Many of the killings actually took place outside the square, around other streets in Beijing, and there were disturbances across the country. I think it's just that because that is such an important point in Chinese history. Even before 1989, it had always been an important place. It's where Mao declared the People's Republic in 1949. It had always been an important point. It's the site of the old Forbidden City. So I think that's why the events of that week, 30 years ago, were synonymous with the square. In fact, this picture um, wasn't taken on the square itself. I don't know the name of that particular road, but that wasn't actually the square itself, the most famous image associated with the protests. There is a lot of there's a lot of plain lies that's told by the regime today. One of them is that it was necessary to put down the protests to maintain the stability of China because agitators and traitors, as they put it, were trying to overthrow the government. Here's the thing: the students were not actually trying to overthrow the government. And if you look at the sort of statements they were making at the time, and those who survived, student leaders like Wang Dan and others, they were calling for democratic reforms within the party. They weren't calling for the overthrow of the Communist Party. They were talking about democratic reforms within the party. These students would have described themselves as socialists. And they actually sang the International, and they were very patriotic. They waved Chinese flags. They were not trying to overthrow the government. This is very important because it is the main excuse that the communist regime uses today. On the very rare occasion that the Communist Party even acknowledged anything happened a few days ago, I forget the specific name of this minister, but he claimed that it was absolutely the right thing to do. Now, that would have been an opportunity to say we've learned from our mistakes or to offer some sort of hope to those grieving relatives. Um, but it just shows how callous the Communist Party still is. And it is the eternal shame of Deng Xiaoping, Li Peng, and subsequent Chinese leaders who have covered this up. It's an absolute travesty. 30 years on, the mothers and the fathers of those young people who were killed, and we'll never know the exact death toll, and of other civilians, it wasn't just students who were killed, we'll never know. They will never get justice, or at least not anytime soon. And they're aging now. They're in their 70s and 80s now. And that is an absolute travesty. In fact, they've been threatened. They've been told not to make any attempt to mark the occasion. And of course, the party is in overdrive in censoring it. Here's my simple proposition to anyone who wants to defend the Chinese Communist Party. If the CCP was acting out of necessity, if they were innocent, then why don't they just come out? Why don't they even make open propaganda about it? Why don't they say, this is what happened and this is why we done it? The fact that they censor the event, the fact the fact they forbid any discussion of it, shows they're guilty as hell. I mean, this was an abomination. Of course, there was anger after that initial crackdown, and I'm sure there was unrest. I'm sure there were some incidents of violence against soldiers, but who could blame those students for getting angry? The People's Liberation Army had fired on the Chinese people. These are the facts, and it's sickening to think that young Chinese today are growing up totally ignorant of what happened. Sir Alan Donald, who was a British ambassador at the time to China, and also he'd served as ambassador to Indonesia, he quoted, he passed away last year, but he quoted sources that he had at the time saying the death toll could have been as high as 10,000. Now, we'll never know. That may be an overestimate, but I think the true toll is probably a lot higher than the official 300 that the government claims, roughly 300. I think the true toll is probably somewhere between those two figures, but I think it's very plausible that it was in the thousands because eyewitness statements spoke of dozens and dozens of bodies that they saw in morgues and around the streets. Um, the student leaders of that time are now exiles. They live in the United States and Taiwan and Hong Kong. Hong Kong is very pivotal to this because um, China is gradually trying to erode the terms of the Sino-British Agreement of 1985, which stressed the importance of a one country, two systems. But it's very clear, and this was the case with the umbrella protest back in 2014, that the party was hell bent on making Hong Kong just another mainland city. The good news is the spirit of young Hong Kongers is just as strong as the spirit of those young people in 1989. They're not going to allow the memories of this event to be forgotten. Student leaders like Wang Dan, and let me just get the other names because there's a article in the London Times. Feng Su, Tai Ling, Lu Gang, Wu Kai Shi. These people, Wang Dan, of course, perhaps the most famous of all the student leaders, they're not going to let it be forgotten. They themselves have mixed views. Some of them feel guilty. They feel that their sort of speech is galvanizing the students, maybe um, could have led to some of the deaths. I don't think they should blame themselves. The responsibility for this atrocity lies entirely with the Chinese government, because even if there were violent elements among the protests, those violent elements only occurred after the decision to send in tanks to what were peaceful protests. And it's simple. If the Communist Party is innocent, if they were putting down an attempted coup d'etat, which it never was, but that's what they insinuate, then why don't they just come clean? Why don't they just be open about it? Why don't they just tell the world we were doing what any government would do? We were trying to put down a coup d'etat. Their silence, their attempts to silence this, their censorship, their cowardly censorship, I think speaks volumes. And I tried something yesterday on my QQ. I tried typing in some keywords. 1989, Tiananmen. I even spelled it backwards. It disappeared immediately. And I have to be honest, I was very tempted to put something there, whether it be this picture or something else, um, see what would happen. Because I think the people I'm connected with have a right to know now. I didn't do it in the end. I chickened out, if I'm being totally honest. Partly because I didn't want to get my account closed, and partly because I thought, okay, well, if I tell my students about this, they could ask questions, they could get themselves into trouble. There's no risk for me. I'm outside China now. But some of my colleagues, quite frankly, well, I know some of them were in the party, and it's just not something I chose to do. But to be honest, I'm not sure how much it would have helped. There's a museum in Hong Kong that's run by young people. One young woman was only 4 years old at the time, so she's about the same age as me, but she was determined that this museum will keep going. I really would like to see that museum protected. It is so very important. Hong Kong is the only place in China where this is marked every every year, but particularly this year with 30 years. As time goes on, the Communist Party want this to be forgotten. It shouldn't be forgotten, not just because of the events of 1989, but the suppression before and since. The Communist Party of China, in my view, is responsible for more deaths of their own people than any other political party in human history. And it's disgusting how they hide the truth from the Chinese people, and it's reprehensible how they are now brainwashing young people to believe this never happened, or if they do find out about it, oh well, we had to put down this violent protest by agitators. It's an insult to the victims, it's an insult to the relatives. I can't imagine the pain that those people are going through, not being able to commemorate their loved ones, not knowing the truth, not having any justice. I mean, the truth about the exact circumstances. We know there was a bloody crackdown. So I didn't really assume to make any new angles with this, but that's my thoughts on it. And like I say, the Communist Party of China has actually done even worse things than Tiananmen Square. I mean, the sort of horrors that took place in the Great Leap Forward, people beaten to death. I mean, that was like Cambodia's killing fields times 10. It was one of the biggest abominations of the 20th century, if not the very worst. That is for a government to do against its own people. Um, One day, it might be 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, the Communist Party of China is not going to be around forever. I do believe that. It may not even be in my lifetime, but at some point, no dictatorship lasts forever. And Xi Jinping has chosen to get more authoritarian. It's definitely got worse. That's why liberal democracies need to stand up to China. China today is not a victim. This is not the 19th century. And so long as they continue to hide this, the rest of the world, or particularly liberal democracies, need to air these commemorations, they need to air these reports, and they need to put pressure on China to reform, because only by reforming can China move forward. Yes, it's moved forward economically. Yes, there's a consumer society, but when it comes to liberty, no, China is still far, far behind um, liberal democracies. Liberal democracies are not perfect, but the situation in China is just, and I've been to the country twice. Um, Tiananmen Square is an example of what happens with unlimited power, of what happens with totalitarianism, and it is yet another glaring reminder of the bloody legacy of communism.